"I have something to say," whispered Mai, as she clutched the small folded note in her hands, her tiny fingers trembling under the weight of every gaze in the grand hall. The Korean wedding reception glimmered with chandeliers that stretched from the high ceilings like frozen waterfalls of crystal, reflecting off polished hardwood floors that gleamed as if freshly waxed just moments ago. Guests in tailored suits and shimmering gowns filled the room with murmurs, their champagne flutes catching the soft amber glow of candlelight, the smell of jasmine and orchids weaving through the air. At the center of the room, Kim Jun-seo stood tall at the altar, his tailored navy suit perfectly fitted, broad shoulders rigid, eyes sharp yet unreadable, his presence commanding more attention than any decoration or flower arrangement could ever hope to. The orchestra swelled, a crescendo of strings punctuating laughter and conversation, but Maya's small heartbeat echoed louder in her own ears than any music could reach. She shifted her weight nervously, glancing at the polished podium in front of her, the microphone gleaming under a single spotlight that seemed to isolate her from the rest of the opulent hall. She could feel the eyes of family members, dignitaries, and strangers alike, each of them expecting a charming anecdote or a sweet song from a child, unaware of the silent storm brewing in the chest of the girl, standing frozen in heels too big for her age. The soft rustle of silk and satin filled the moments as the room collectively held its breath, 100 conversations fading into a tense quiet that wrapped around Mai like a heavy velvet curtain. In that stillness, she thought of the months she had spent preparing, the rehearsed words whispered into the mirror at home, the nights she had dreamed of standing here and speaking something that mattered, something that could not be ignored. She could hear the faint tinkle of glasses in the distance, the subtle footfalls of attendants adjusting table settings, but none of it touched her awareness as her focus narrowed to the man at the altar. Kim Jun-seo's piercing dark eyes, usually so cold and composed, now seemed to flicker with the slightest trace of curiosity, a minuscule crack in the carefully constructed mask of authority he wore like armor. Maya's lips parted slightly, and the words she had practiced, the ones small enough to fit on a single scrap of paper, yet powerful enough to shake the decorum of this hall, pressed against her tongue. She felt a sudden rush, the warmth of sweat on her palms, the flutter in her chest that felt like both fear and purpose intertwined. The guests leaned forward slightly in their seats, some craning their necks, some whispering softly to one another, but all were drawn to the rising anticipation. The scent of polished wood mingled with subtle perfume as the spotlight seemed to lean closer, and I felt as though the world had condensed into a single, fragile point, her voice. Then, with a steadying breath that betrayed none of the anxiety coiling in her stomach, she placed her small hands on the microphone stand, adjusted its height just enough to reach, and glanced once at Kim Jun-seo, whose gaze held steady, calculating and unblinking. The orchestra's strings dipped in a brief, suspended note, the chatter of the room suspended in a delicate hush, and the soft click of heels on marble echoed faintly across the hall as I inhaled once more, feeling the gravity of every eye upon her, the weight of every expectation, the sharp contrast between her diminutive frame and the sprawling, extravagant wealth surrounding her. And then she began to speak, the first syllables breaking through the tense silence, carrying not just her voice, but the quiet authority of courage into the heart of the room. The hall held its collective breath as Maya's small voice carried across the polished room, the crystal chandeliers reflecting golden light onto faces frozen in surprise and curiosity. Guests leaned forward, their laughter and chatter evaporating into a tense silence that seemed to press against the high ceilings. Maya adjusted the note in her hands, feeling the smooth folds of the paper, the creases worn from nervous anticipation, and for a moment allowed herself a brief mental flashback to the hour she had spent rehearsing in her bedroom, whispering the 7 words over and over into the mirror, imagining every possible reaction, every gasp, every quiet nod of acknowledgement she could hope for. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears, loud against the soft hum of air conditioning and the faint clinking of glasses in the distance. Yet she remained grounded by the knowledge that this was her moment, the culmination of every quiet lesson in courage she had ever learned. Kim Genesio's dark eyes remained fixed on her, measuring, calculating, but something unspoken flickered in their depths, a subtle recognition of bravery, or perhaps the awareness that the rules of his meticulously organized world were about to be challenged in a way he had never anticipated. He stood straight, hands loosely at his sides, the tailored suit sharp along every seam, the polished leather shoes reflecting the candlelight from the tables below. And though his posture remained commanding, there was an imperceptible shift, a softening of the rigid tension in his shoulders as he observed my step confidently closer to the microphone, each small footstep echoing lightly against the hardwood floor. The guest's eyes were drawn to her, as if magnetized, whispers rising in delicate waves, the clinking of champagne flutes fading, and the faint rustle of silk and taffeta from the assembled crowd punctuating the suspended moment. Maya's gaze flicked briefly to the lavish floral arrangements that lined the aisle, the soft petals contrasting with the precise, polished lines of the banquet tables, and she inhaled deeply, steadying herself, feeling the weight of expectation not just in the room, but on the delicate balance of her own determination and the silent hope that her words could resonate beyond the grandeur of the ceremony. As she placed her hands lightly on the microphone stand, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingertips, she thought of the significance of every onlooker, the whispered judgments and assumptions she had sensed upon entering, and the quiet power of the small voice now poised to cut through the layers of ceremony, wealth, and tradition. The orchestra had paused, the soft swell of strings hanging like a cloud over the audience, and Mai knew that in this suspended heartbeat, she was no longer a little girl stepping nervously onto a stage. She was the conduit for truth, for courage, for the subtle shaking of a world built upon expectation and decorum. Her lips parted, ready to deliver the words that would draw all eyes, all attention, all silent recognition. And in that instant, even the most polished, controlled faces around the hall, including Kim Genesio's, held the faintest flicker of wonder, an acknowledgement that what was about to be spoken, though brief, could ripple far beyond the confines of the opulent hall, bridging the gap between power and innocence, expectation and revelation. The soft murmur of the audience seemed to stretch into a long, drawn-out note as Mai paused for a fraction of a second, the 7 words lingering in the space between her lips and the expectant silence of the hall. Her small frame was illuminated by the chandelier above, each crystal prism catching the golden light and casting tiny rainbows across the polished hardwood floor. Kim Genesio remained immobile at the altar, his dark eyes fixed upon her with a measured intensity, every muscle in his tall frame taut yet restrained, as if he were holding back a torrent of emotion behind the calm facade. Around them, the guests leaned forward ever so slightly, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, curiosity, and a faint stir of admiration, realizing that this small girl was about to command more attention than any elaborate floral arrangement or carefully crafted table setting. Mai drew a quiet, controlled breath, feeling the cool metal of the microphone under her fingertips, the textured note she had carried pressed lightly against her palm as a reminder of the thought and courage embedded in each word she was about to speak. The orchestra had paused, leaving only the faint hum of air conditioning and the subtle rustle of silk and satin as the assembled crowd seemed to suspend their very breaths in anticipation. Her eyes flicked briefly across the room, catching the sparkling eyes of children seated at the tables, the slight twitch of a hand adjusting a pearl bracelet, the subtle tilt of heads among the older guests who sensed something significant unfolding in this moment, and then returned to Kim Genesio, whose gaze seemed to pierce through the polished veneer of ceremony, reading not only her posture, but the intent behind her hesitation. The warm scent of jasmine from the floral arrangements mingled with the faint hint of polished mahogany and candle wax, grounding Mai in the physical space even as her mind raced with every possible outcome, every reaction, every subtle shift in the demeanor of the man who had been the embodiment of authority and meticulous control in the hall for the past hour. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears, loud against the otherwise quiet space. And yet with every beat, her confidence grew, a steady pulse of resolve that pushed her forward. The guests had stopped whispering entirely now. Their collective attention funneled to the center stage where innocence met audacity, and even the soft scrape of chairs against polished floors seemed amplified in the charged atmosphere. Maya's lips parted finally, a delicate tremor in the sound as she began to speak, her voice carrying not only the weight of the words themselves, but the unwavering courage of a child who had prepared for this singular moment with patience and determination. The light from the chandeliers glinted off the crystal of the decorative centerpieces, casting fractured, shimmering patterns onto the walls and ceiling, and in this delicate dance of illumination, every eye, every face, every whispering thought in the room was anchored to her small but undeniable presence. Kim Genesio's eyes flickered slightly, a minuscule crack in his composed exterior, revealing a flicker of intrigue, a subtle recognition of the truth and bravery that had just stepped forward in the quietest, most unassuming form imaginable. In that suspended heartbeat, Mai became the axis upon which the entire room seemed to turn, a quiet, commanding force that held the attention and respect of every observer without raising her voice beyond the simple, clear cadence of each carefully chosen word, setting the stage for a moment that none present would soon forget. The room seemed to hold its breath as Maya's words lingered, soft yet insistent, echoing off the high ceilings and polished floors, each syllable carrying the weight of courage far beyond her small frame. Guests froze in place, their champagne flutes suspended midair, eyes wide and mouths slightly open as they tried to reconcile the innocence of the child with the gravity of what she had just said. The light from the chandeliers caught the edges of crystal goblets and silver candelabras, casting dancing reflections across the room that made the moment feel almost suspended in time, a delicate balance of anticipation and awe. Kim Jae-seo's dark eyes, usually cold and unreadable, flicked from the crowd to Mai, registering not just the words themselves, but the boldness behind them, the quiet determination in the tilt of her chin and the steadiness of her gaze. And for a brief heartbeat, the air between them was charged with unspoken understanding. The guests shifted slightly, some whispering to one another in hushed tones, but even those soft murmurs could not pierce the fragile cocoon of silence that had formed around Mai. As if the room itself recognized that something extraordinary was unfolding in the center of the grand hall. Mai felt the cool metal of the microphone beneath her hands, grounding her, while her mind traced the path she had imagined 100 times before, each possibility replaying in her thoughts, every reaction considered and measured, yet now unfolding in the unpredictable reality of the room filled with high society, fine suits, and glittering gowns. She glanced briefly at the orchestra, poised with instruments raised, awaiting the next cue that would never come. The soft rustle of sheet music and the polished shine of violins reflecting her own tension back to her in quiet waves. Kim Juniseo remained still at the altar, his posture commanding, yet his sharp gaze softened imperceptibly, the slightest shift in expression betraying curiosity and perhaps a spark of respect, a recognition that this small figure before him had disrupted the carefully choreographed order of his world with nothing more than words and presence. Mai drew a quiet, steadying breath, feeling the warmth of the ambient light on her face, the faint perfume of flowers mingling with the polished scent of the hardwood, the delicate weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders, yet strengthening her resolve, turning fear into focused intent. The guest's collective focus narrowed to her, every glance, every subtle movement captured in the attention that now encircled her like an invisible spotlight, each individual reaction a note in a silent symphony that pulsed through the hall. Her lips moved, carefully articulating each word with clarity and purpose, the 7 words she had rehearsed threading through the tense atmosphere like a delicate, unbroken line connecting courage, truth, and a quiet authority that could not be ignored. Kim Junesio's eyes followed each movement, absorbing the cadence of her voice, the rise and fall of the syllables, the pause, and the breath that punctuated her message, and the room seemed to shrink around this exchange, collapsing the grandeur of chandeliers, polished floors, and silken gowns into a single, suspended moment of connection, anticipation, and transformative quiet. In that charged, delicate space, Maya's presence became the fulcrum of attention, the pivot around which the ceremony now teetered, every eye fixed on her, every ear attuned, every heart unknowingly holding its own breath as the hall awaited the unseen, unfolding consequence of the courage that had spoken so plainly, so directly, and yet with the subtle, undeniable authority of truth. The guests' collective focus intensified as Maya's words hung in the air, delicate yet unwavering, the 7 syllables resonating through the grand hall like a quiet, unyielding current beneath the surface of an ornate, glittering river. The polished hardwood floor reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers, shimmering with each subtle movement of the assembly as eyes shifted, eyebrows lifted, and breaths caught in silent synchrony. Maya's small hands gripped the microphone stand, the cool metal grounding her as she felt a mixture of nervous anticipation and quiet triumph, the culmination of every careful rehearsal and whispered practice session over the past weeks. Across the room, Kim Juniseo remained a figure of controlled composure, his dark eyes fixed on the girl with a penetrating intensity, yet the slight softening at the corners of his gaze betrayed an unexpected recognition of the courage embodied in her still, determined posture. Every polished surface, the silvered edges of candelabras, the crystal of wine glasses, the delicate embroidery on the guest's formal attire, seemed to pause in reflection, holding the light and shadows in suspension as if the room itself were waiting for the next movement in this fragile, tension-filled tableau. The orchestra, now silent, added only the faint hum of anticipation, and the gentle rustle of fabric from the seated audience punctuated the room's stillness, drawing all focus to the center stage where innocence confronted expectation. I inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her, the measured distance of each footstep that had brought her here, and the subtle, almost imperceptible anticipation of those around her, whose minds began to stretch beyond the formality of the ceremony toward the raw authenticity of this small presence commanding attention. Her eyes scanned briefly, catching the fleeting expressions of guests, wide-eyed children gripping their parents' hands, subtle nods of curiosity from young couples, and the faint, impressed tilt of heads among those who had underestimated the power of her quiet authority, and then returned to Kim Juniseo, who maintained an immovable posture yet seemed to draw inward, his broad frame a silent counterpoint to her delicate courage. The floral arrangements lining the aisles emitted a soft, calming fragrance that mingled with the polished scent of the hardwood and the faint whisper of polished metal and glass, creating an atmosphere that seemed simultaneously formal and intimate, amplifying the significance of every word, every pause, every slight adjustment of posture or glance. Maya's lips moved with deliberate care, each syllable crisp and confident, threading a subtle rhythm that carried through the quiet hall, creating an invisible thread connecting her to every observer, binding attention, empathy, and wonder in a single, suspended moment. The guest's eyes traced her movements as if following the arc of an unseen narrative, their collective awareness forming a quiet energy that emphasized the gravity and bravery of her act, while Kim Juso's expression, though stoic, revealed an almost imperceptible shift, a flicker of contemplation, curiosity, and recognition of the quiet, unassuming power that had just stepped into the spotlight, poised to leave an impression that would ripple far beyond the confines of the room. The chandeliers above, the polished floors below, the delicate arrangement of guests and attendants, all seemed to conspire in silent witness to this moment, capturing the tension, the courage, and the potential for transformation embodied in a single, small voice standing tall against the weight of ceremony and expectation, a voice that held the promise of change, reflection, and the undeniable resonance of integrity and bravery. Kim Janesio's gaze remained fixed on Mai as the soft echo of her words faded into the elegant hush that filled the grand hall, his posture unyielding yet subtly shifting, the smallest tightening of his jaw hinting at an internal calculation he dared not voice aloud. The golden chandeliers above flickered with the reflections of 1,000 eyes, each sparkling crystal catching the ambient light and scattering it across the polished hardwood, making the ornate details of the room shimmer like a living mosaic as the audience held its collective breath. Maya's small hands gripped the microphone stand with steady resolve, the cool metal grounding her amidst the swirl of rich fabrics, whispered conversations, and the delicate scent of jasmine and roses that filled the air. The assembled guests leaned ever so slightly forward in their seats, sensing the gravity of the moment, their murmurs reduced to a near silence, leaving only the faint hum of the orchestra and the subtle scrape of silk as attendants shifted to accommodate the tension that had seized the room. Kim Janesio's eyes scanned the hall, noting the reactions of his family, friends, and business associates, the wide eyes of children clutching at their parents' hands, the small, impressed nods of those who had expected ceremony and frivolity, but were now confronted with the courage of a single child commanding attention with quiet authority. The polished floors reflected the soft illumination from above. Each step Mai had taken seeming magnified in importance as she remained poised at the microphone. Her voice now a measured cadence of clarity and intent, every syllable chosen for precision and weight, carrying not just meaning, but an unspoken assertion of confidence and moral insight. The light shimmered on the silver candelabras and crystal goblets, casting fractured rainbows across the walls that mirrored the tension and anticipation of the room, and every guest seemed suspended in a delicate balance between decorum and the recognition of something extraordinary unfolding before them. Maya's gaze flicked briefly to the arrangements of flowers along the aisle, the delicate petals and green foliage a contrasting softness against the stately grandeur of the setting, grounding her in a world that was both magnificent and intimidating, and then returned to Kim Janesio, whose composed posture belied a subtle, growing awareness of the significance of her presence. The audience remained rapt, each subtle intake of breath or quiet shuffle carrying amplified weight, while Maya's confidence grew, a gentle radiance of determination and calm threading through the stillness, bridging the gap between the opulent surroundings and the small, steadfast figure at the center of attention. The chandeliers reflected in the polished surfaces of the tables, the subtle glint of jewelry on seated guests, and the precise folds of elegant fabrics all became a backdrop for the quiet power and clarity that Mai embodied, and in that delicate, suspended moment, Kim Janesio's eyes softened imperceptibly, a silent acknowledgement of the courage and insight that had emerged amidst the grandeur of the ceremony, transforming the expectations of the hall into a shared, reverent pause where the presence of integrity and quiet strength commanded respect and contemplation. The tension in the hall thickened as Maya's small voice steadied on the microphone, each word deliberate and precise, filling the space with a quiet authority that seemed impossible for someone so young. The chandeliers above caught the faintest flicker of movement in the audience, scattering light across the polished hardwood floors, the crystal glinting like tiny stars in a suspended galaxy, drawing all eyes toward the center of the room. Kim Janesio remained a figure of composed authority at the altar, his broad frame still and commanding. Yet there was an imperceptible shift in the tilt of his head, a subtle softening in the set of his jaw, an almost inaudible intake of breath that suggested a mind quietly turning, absorbing the weight of the courage displayed before him. Around them, the guests leaned forward, their expressions caught between astonishment and admiration, each subtle movement of their bodies mirrored in the slight rustle of silk and satin, the quiet clink of glasses, the soft shuffle of feet on polished wood. Maya's eyes scanned the room for a fleeting instant, taking in the faces of the children who watched her with wide-eyed wonder, the adults whose lips parted ever so slightly in surprise, the faint, Impressed nods exchanged between guests who had underestimated the quiet force of this small presence, and then returned to Kim Juniseo, who now regarded her not merely with curiosity, but with a dawning acknowledgement of the quiet authority that she projected. The delicate floral arrangements lining the aisles released their gentle fragrance into the room, mingling with the subtle scent of polished wood and wax floors, creating a sensory backdrop that grounded my even as the weight of every gaze pressed upon her. She shifted her stance, feeling the cool metal of the microphone stand against her palms, steadying herself with a tactile connection to something real amidst the swirl of expectation and opulence that surrounded her. Each word she spoke now carried a rhythm and cadence that drew every listener in, connecting them to the thoughtfulness and bravery behind her carefully chosen phrases, transforming the attention of the room into a palpable current that flowed toward her, highlighting the contrast between the grandeur of the ceremony and the simplicity of her presence. Kim Juneseo's eyes, dark and unwavering, flickered slightly with the recognition of something profound, a subtle widening that suggested awareness of the courage and integrity contained in this small, deliberate act. The guests collectively held their breath, each minor movement, an intake of air, a shift in weight, a gentle clearing of the throat, amplified in the heightened quiet, emphasizing the suspended gravity of the moment. Maya's posture remained upright, her gaze unwavering, the gentle tilt of her chin and the steadiness of her voice weaving a quiet thread of authority and sincerity that stretched from the microphone to every corner of the room. The chandeliers reflected across the polished surfaces, the glint of crystal on the tables, and the delicate embroidery of guests' attire all combined into a cinematic tableau where every element seemed to emphasize the gravity and significance of her presence. In that singular moment, the balance of power and attention had shifted subtly, the ceremonial opulence fading into the background as the quiet courage of a child commanded the room, drawing an imperceptible, yet undeniable, acknowledgement from Kim Juniseo, whose composed exterior now bore the faintest trace of admiration and contemplation, a silent recognition that even in a world of structured grandeur, the smallest voice could echo with profound impact. The 7 words left Maya's lips and floated across the grand hall, a delicate, powerful cadence that seemed to slow time itself as every guest froze in place, their eyes wide, glasses trembling slightly in their hands, and the faint whisper of silk and satin brushing against polished floors underscoring the sudden gravity of the moment. The chandeliers above reflected the golden light across the room, scattering tiny prisms over the guests' faces, capturing astonishment, confusion, and an unspoken reverence, while the faint scent of jasmine from the floral arrangements mingled with the polished scent of hardwood and wax furniture, creating an atmosphere that was at once opulent and intensely intimate. Kim Juniseo remained at the altar, a figure of composed authority, his tailored navy suit impeccably fitted, broad shoulders squared, yet his dark eyes betrayed a subtle flicker of surprise, the smallest crease at the corner suggesting that the carefully constructed order of the ceremony had been interrupted by something unanticipated yet undeniably meaningful. Maya's small hands tightened slightly on the microphone, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingertips, and for the first time, the microphone seemed less a tool and more a conduit, carrying not just her words, but the courage, preparation, and intent that had led her to this singular moment. The guests' collective focus sharpened, whispers evaporating into a suspended silence that allowed her words to resonate fully, each syllable threading a delicate tension through the room, binding attention, expectation, and admiration in a single, suspended current that seemed to stretch from the ornate altar to the farthest corners of the hall. Her gaze swept briefly over the audience, capturing the wide-eyed wonder of children, the barely perceptible nods of adults who recognized the quiet bravery before them, and the subtle tightening of lips among those who had expected a conventional, polite ceremony rather than the profound statement of confidence that had just been delivered. Kim Juneseo's expression, though measured, shifted imperceptibly, a slow softening of his rigid posture, the faintest sign that the weight of her words had pierced the careful exterior he maintained for the sake of decorum and expectation, introducing a moment of reflection and acknowledgement that carried a depth far beyond the surface of the event. The room itself seemed to lean in, the polished floors reflecting the glow of crystal and candlelight, the delicate embroidery on gowns and suits catching fragments of illumination that highlighted the stark contrast between the grandeur of the hall and the poised small figure at its center, emphasizing the extraordinary presence of courage, clarity, and quiet authority that Mai exuded. Every subtle shift, the intake of a breath, the soft shuffle of feet, the gentle tilt of a head, amplified in the charged quiet, forming an invisible web of attention that flowed toward her, wrapping the space in anticipation, reverence, and the unspoken acknowledgement of the moment's significance. Mai's words, though few, carried a rhythm and resonance that seemed to expand beyond the microphone, threading through the hushed audience, connecting hearts, opening the perception of Kim Jun-seo, and transforming the ceremonial splendor into a stage where the smallest, most deliberate voice commanded attention, respect, and reflection in a way that would ripple through memory long after the light from the chandeliers faded into quiet twilight. The hall fell into a stunned, reverent silence as Mai's 7 words reverberated softly through the space, the grandeur of the chandeliers and polished floors fading into the background as every eye, every heart, and every subtle shift in posture became centered on the small figure at the microphone. The gentle hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of silk and taffeta from the audience seemed to accentuate the gravity of the moment, making even the softest breath or movement feel amplified in the charged atmosphere. Kim Jun-seo remained still at the altar, his broad shoulders squared, his hands resting lightly at his sides. Yet the intensity in his dark eyes had shifted, a quiet spark of astonishment and reflection breaking through the composure he had maintained for the entire ceremony. The guests, previously poised with polite smiles and the murmured hum of social expectation, now exchanged glances that combined shock, admiration, and an unspoken recognition of the courage displayed by someone so small and seemingly fragile. Mai felt the slight vibration of the microphone beneath her fingertips, grounding her, while the polished metal reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers, a tangible reminder that her presence, though diminutive in size, was monumental in effect. The floral arrangements lining the aisle swayed ever so slightly with the subtle movement of air from whispered breaths and shifting chairs, their scent of jasmine and fresh greenery mingling with the faint aroma of polished wood and candle wax, forming an invisible aura that seemed to cradle the courage emanating from her voice. The audience remained frozen, every subtle movement, an intake of breath, a soft shuffle of feet, the gentle tilt of a head, magnified in the stillness, as if the room itself were holding time to honor the gravity of the message. Kim Jun-seo's expression softened imperceptibly, the rigid tension in his shoulders easing by a fraction as he processed the depth and deliberate clarity of Mai's words, recognizing in her courage and presence a truth that transcended ceremony, expectation, and decorum. The guests' eyes traced her every motion, their attention bound not by formality, but by the authenticity and conviction projected in each measured syllable, their admiration growing in quiet increments as the hall seemed to suspend the social hierarchy and allow a single voice to command its full attention. Mai's gaze swept the audience once more, noting the wide-eyed children, the subtle nods from adults, the fleeting expressions of awe from those who had underestimated the weight that courage could carry, and then returned to Kim Jun-seo, whose posture, though composed, now radiated a faint, almost imperceptible acknowledgement of the power and significance of this small but determined presence. The crystal chandeliers reflected in the polished surfaces of tables and glassware, scattering light like a constellation of tiny stars, amplifying the sense of suspended gravity and highlighting the remarkable stillness and focus of the moment. In this delicate, charged space, every element, The glow of golden light, the shimmering reflections, the attentive faces of the guests, and the poised figure of Mai combined to create a tableau of quiet reverence, respect, and the undeniable impact of courage, focus, and the transformative power of a single, unwavering voice in the midst of grandeur and expectation, leaving the ceremony poised on the edge of a revelation that would resonate long after the echoes of the words had faded into memory. Kim Jin-seo's eyes softened ever so slightly as he took a careful, deliberate step forward, the polished black leather of his shoes echoing faintly against the hardwood floor, each measured movement emphasizing the shift in energy within the grand hall. The chandeliers above caught the subtle motion, casting fractured beams of light across the faces of guests whose attention remained riveted on the small figure at the microphone, their expressions suspended between astonishment and admiration as the gravity of Mai's courage settled into the room. The soft scent of jasmine and fresh greenery from the aisle arrangements mingled with the warm glow of candlelight, creating a gentle, enveloping atmosphere that seemed to both heighten the importance of the moment and soften the formal rigidity of the setting. Mai's posture remained upright and poised, her small hands gripping the microphone stand with quiet determination, the cool metal a tangible anchor against the swelling anticipation and weight of every eye upon her. Around them, the polished floors reflected subtle flickers of chandelier light and crystal, emphasizing the contrast between the grandeur of the hall and the quiet, unwavering focus of a child whose presence now dominated the attention of all. Kim Jin-seo's gaze traveled slowly across the audience, noting the reactions of friends, family, and dignitaries alike, the wide-eyed children, the subtle nods of respect from adults, the faint glimmer of surprise that danced across the features of those who had underestimated the power of a single, brave voice. His hands, relaxed yet commanding, rested lightly at his sides, and with each passing moment, the edges of his carefully maintained composure softened imperceptibly, revealing a flicker of curiosity, contemplation, and growing respect for the courage that had just stepped forward to interrupt expectation and ceremony. The room itself seemed to lean in toward this exchange, the subtle hum of the air conditioning and the gentle shuffle of chairs amplified by the collective focus on the moment, creating a suspended tension that wrapped around every guest and every polished surface, from silver candelabras to crystal goblets, drawing them into the quiet authority of Mai's presence. The delicate, precise articulation of her words echoed in the polished space, threading through the hushed audience and establishing a rhythm that combined clarity, poise, and a gentle insistence, asserting attention and commanding reflection from all present. Kim Jin-seo's expression remained composed yet alert, the smallest nod almost imperceptible but meaningful, a silent acknowledgement of the depth, bravery, and integrity that had just been displayed before him, the grandeur of the hall and the expectation of ceremony yielding to the quiet force of truth and courage. The guests' reactions remained subtle but telling, slight shifts in posture, soft exhalations, and focused glances that suggested admiration and respect had replaced curiosity and casual observation. Mai's gaze swept the room once more, noting the unspoken understanding that had spread through the assembly, the fragile power of a small voice now amplified by attention, focus, and authenticity. And as her eyes returned to Kim Jin-seo, she recognized a mirrored acknowledgement, the tiniest crease of a smile, a spark of recognition that even in the most formal and meticulously orchestrated settings, courage and honesty could command presence, respect, and reflection in a way that would be remembered long after the chandeliers dimmed and the room returned to ordinary expectation. As the room remained suspended in quiet awe, Mai took a careful step back from the microphone, her small frame still poised and upright, yet a subtle relaxation rippled through her shoulders as the weight of the moment slowly settled around her. The chandeliers above scattered light like a delicate constellation across the polished floors, the reflections dancing across the faces of the audience as their astonishment gave way to a quiet reverence, each guest slowly absorbing the significance of the courage that had just been displayed. Kim Juniseo remained at the altar, his broad shoulders steady, his dark eyes now softened with a trace of warmth and acknowledgement, the rigid line of his jaw easing ever so slightly as he took in the composure and clarity that my hat exhibited. The guest's subtle movements, a slight lean forward, a careful adjustment of posture, the gentle intake of breath, formed a rhythm in the room, a silent chorus of admiration and reflective recognition that elevated the small act into something larger than ceremony. Maya's gaze swept across the assembly, capturing the wide-eyed children who whispered to one another in awe, the adults whose subtle nods reflected an unspoken respect, and the faint, impressed glances exchanged among those who had underestimated the quiet force of a small voice capable of commanding attention and reflection. The soft scent of jasmine from the aisle arrangements mingled with the polished wood and waxed floors, grounding the moment in the tangible, while the intangible sense of wonder hung thick in the air. Every polished surface, the crystal goblets, the silvered candelabras, the glimmering chandeliers, seemed to reflect the focused energy emanating from Mai, magnifying her presence far beyond her small stature, creating a cinematic tableau in which the interplay of light, color, and attention emphasized the depth and bravery of her act. Kim Juniseo took a measured breath, the slightest shift of his eyes toward the child suggesting a dawning recognition of the weight her words carried, not merely for the ceremony, but for the awareness they had stirred in all who were present. The audience collectively held its quiet, their attention an invisible current that threaded through the room, connecting the polished grandeur of the hall with the unassuming authority of a single deliberate presence at the center. Maya's small hands rested lightly on the microphone stand, the cool metal anchoring her as she allowed the tension to ebb slightly, knowing that her intention had been conveyed and that her bravery had commanded respect without a single embellishment beyond the truth of her voice and her posture. The soft hum of the room, the gentle rustle of fabric, and the glinting reflections of light on crystal and polished would combine to create an atmosphere in which every detail, the careful embroidery of gowns, the subtle expressions of the guests, the poised stance of Kim Juniseo, served to frame the significance of a moment that balanced courage, clarity, and integrity against the backdrop of ceremony and opulence. In that delicate pause, Mai felt a quiet satisfaction, a recognition that the smallest voice could create ripples of acknowledgement and admiration, and Kim Juniseo's eyes, dark and steady, held a measured appreciation that spoke to an unspoken bond formed through respect, presence, and the undeniable power of authenticity in the midst of grandeur, leaving the room suspended in a memory that would linger far beyond the soft fading of chandelier light. The soft light of the chandeliers bathed the hall in a warm glow, reflecting off the polished floors and crystal accents, creating an atmosphere that felt suspended between reality and reverence as Mai stepped back slightly from the microphone, her small frame still poised, but her shoulders easing with a quiet confidence. The audience remained hushed, every eye tracking her movements, every subtle exhalation amplified by the tension that hung delicately over the space, while the gentle rustle of silk, taffeta, and polished shoes punctuated the stillness in a rhythm that underscored the significance of what had just occurred. Kim Jiseo's dark eyes softened further, the faintest glimmer of acknowledgement in the depth of his gaze, as though the deliberate courage and clarity of Maya's presence had shifted the very perception of the room around him, making even the most ornate details of the ceremony, the crystal chandeliers, the silvered candelabras, the carefully arranged floral displays, fade into the background in comparison to the quiet authority of the child before him. The scent of fresh jasmine mingled with the polished aroma of hardwood floors, grounding the moment in tangible reality as the audience's collective focus held tightly on the interplay between presence and attention, creating a subtle undercurrent of reflection, admiration, and respect that seemed to thread every corner of the hall. Maya's small hands rested lightly on the microphone stand, the cool metal a steady reminder of her control and poise, as her gaze swept across the room, acknowledging the wide-eyed children, the gentle nods of adults, and the fleeting expressions of quiet wonder on faces that had anticipated ceremony but were now immersed in authenticity. Each polished surface, the glint of crystal on wine glasses, the shimmer of silver accents, the subtle reflections of chandeliers, served to heighten the impression of her presence, turning the room into a tableau in which light, color, and attention were drawn toward the demonstration of courage and clarity. Kim Genesio's posture remained composed yet measured, the faintest shift in his stance signaling recognition of the impact of her actions, a quiet reverence for the integrity and bravery that had just been manifested. While the audience responded in kind, their small gestures of acknowledgement forming a subtle chorus of respect that resonated through the space. The polished floors echoed the soft movements of chairs and footsteps, while the faint hum of the environment and a gentle flow of ambient conversation added depth to the stillness, allowing the resonance of the moment to permeate fully. Maya's presence now commanded the attention of the hall without effort. Every small movement, every deliberate breath, every slight adjustment of posture threading into the tapestry of observation, focus, and silent acclaim, while the grandeur of the setting, the chandeliers, the floral arrangements, and the meticulous details of decoration served as a contrasting backdrop that amplified the significance of authenticity and bravery in the midst of formality. The room seemed to hold itself in quiet contemplation, the attention directed to the child at the center, and in that suspended space, Kim Genesio's composed exterior held the faintest trace of admiration and reflection, a recognition that the resonance of courage, integrity, and quiet strength could elevate a single voice to command respect and leave a lasting impression, transforming the ceremonial grandeur into a shared experience of acknowledgement and contemplation that would linger long. After the light from the chandeliers softened into twilight, the hall remained suspended in a gentle, reverent hush as I stepped back from the microphone, her small frame radiating a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the space more fully than any decorative arrangement or carefully curated detail ever could. The chandeliers above scattered light across polished hardwood floors and crystal surfaces, creating a luminous web that reflected the collective attention of the audience, their faces illuminated with a mix of wonder, admiration, and thoughtful recognition. Kim Genesio's dark eyes, steady and composed, followed her every movement, a subtle glimmer of reflection and respect softening the commanding intensity that had defined his presence throughout the ceremony. The delicate scent of jasmine from the floral arrangements mingled with the polished wood and faint candle wax, adding a tangible warmth to the atmosphere that complemented the quiet resonance of the moment. Guests remained poised, each subtle gesture, a small intake of breath, a careful shift in posture, a faint nod, amplifying the impression of significance as they collectively absorbed the impact of what had unfolded. Maya's gaze swept across the room, acknowledging the wide-eyed children who seemed to see a world expanded by courage, the adults whose subtle expressions reflected admiration and contemplation, and the few who exchanged quick, impressed glances with neighbors, each realization quietly reinforcing the importance of authenticity and quiet authority in a setting governed by ceremony and expectation. The microphone stand remained a steady anchor beneath her hands, the cool metal a tangible reminder of the control, poise, and deliberation that had carried her through the preceding moments, allowing her presence to assert itself without embellishment. Crystal goblets, silvered candelabras, and the polished woodwork of the tables reflected the ambient light in soft, fractured patterns that seemed to underscore the juxtaposition of opulent surroundings and the remarkable gravity of a child's quiet courage. Kim Genesio's posture, though composed, exhibited an imperceptible shift, the tiniest of adjustments signaling recognition of the significance of the act, a subtle nod to the bravery, insight, and clarity that had interrupted expectation and reshaped attention in the room. The air seemed to hum softly with anticipation and reflection. Every element, the faint rustle of fabric, The gentle glimmer of light on polished surfaces, the careful stillness of the audience, threading together into a tapestry of shared understanding, highlighting the resonance of integrity and courage that had been communicated without force or flourish. Maya's presence had become a focal point that drew attention not through volume or spectacle, but through deliberate intention, clear articulation, and unwavering composure, allowing the subtle power of authenticity to redefine the energy of the room. As the guests continued to process the scene, their collective respect, curiosity, and quiet admiration formed an invisible acknowledgement that this moment, though brief and seemingly simple, had transformed the ceremonial setting into a space where the smallest, most deliberate voice could command presence, influence perception, and leave a lasting impression on every observer. Kim Genesio's eyes held the faintest trace of acknowledgement, a silent understanding that courage and clarity, even when expressed through the gentlest of forms, could create a ripple effect of recognition and reflection that would endure long after the room had returned to ordinary expectation, leaving the grandeur of chandeliers, floral arrangements, and polished surfaces as a subtle, supportive backdrop to the enduring impact of authenticity, presence, and quiet strength.